Our scripture lesson this morning comes from Luke 23, 26 through 34. As they led Jesus away, a man named Simon, who was from Cyrene, happened to be coming in from the countryside. The soldiers seized him and put the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A large crowd trailed behind, including many grief-stricken women. But Jesus turned and said to them, "Daughters of Jerusalem, don't weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming when they will say, 'Fortunate indeed are the women who are childless, the wombs that have not borne a child, and the breasts that have never nursed.' People will beg the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and plead with the hills, 'Bury us.' For if these things are done when the tree is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others, both criminals, were led out to be executed with him. When they came to a place called the Skull, they nailed him to the cross. And the criminals were also crucified, one on his right and one on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing." The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Adri. I invite you to turn with me in your Bibles to, where are we here? Luke chapter 23. As we kick off our Lenten sermon series, I have entitled it Greater Marching Orders from the Cross, and it is based on Jesus' words in John chapter 14, verse 12, when he looks ahead to the time when he will be leaving his disciples to return to heaven, and he promises them something that seems outlandish at the time, but he says this: "Whoever believes in me will do the works I have been doing, and they will do even greater things than these." And so as we move through our Lenten series today, our Easter series, what we're going to see is that from the cross, as the last breaths of his life are evaporating away, Jesus gives several different final instructions to the people who are following him so that they can be equipped to accomplish these greater things. And so you can see where we are today and where we will be moving between now and Easter Sunday, which will be on April 12th. And so we begin today with the idea of a forgiving heart. And I can already anticipate what some of you are thinking in your minds. You're thinking, "Really, Pastor Brian, we're going to talk about forgiveness again. You talk about forgiveness all the time. In fact, you have probably talked about forgiveness a couple of times in the last year already." And yes, probably I have. I think it's good to talk about it again today for a very simple reason, which is that in my clinical practice, I have discovered over the years that most problems, whether it be depression, whether it be anger, whether it be anxiety, whether it be relational problems, tends to have its roots in forgiveness or lack thereof. In his best-selling book, Healing is a Choice, Stephen Arterburn writes about this, and he talks about why people get trapped in unforgiveness so easily. And he calls it the big lie of justifiable resentment. In other words, he says people go through life and they carry resentment, they carry unforgiveness in their hearts because they keep telling themselves, "I deserve this. I deserve to be able to hang on to this. It's okay." This is not what Jesus was talking about when he said to forgive. The big lie goes like this: forgiveness is only for those who deserve it or earn it. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I'm guessing many of you would agree with me that you have gone through some or maybe all of your life believing that in your heart. Forgiveness is for people who recognize they've hurt me and who come to me and they are sufficiently contrite. They are sufficiently sorry for what they've done, and they grovel at my feet, and eventually I say, "Oh, okay, finally, I'll forgive you." What we're going to see today is that we are challenged to forgive a much broader scope of people in our lives. Arterburn observes this when he talks about why forgiveness is important. Despite the support you receive from family and friends, justifiable resentment will seriously damage your life. It deprives you of you. It diminishes your life. It hurts your relationship with God. But the worst consequence is that it keeps you in bondage to an event. Your life becomes about one thing. In other words, your life becomes about that time years ago when that person hurt me, that time last week when that person said a careless word, that time just a few months ago when that person didn't acknowledge me when they saw me downtown. And I'm carrying that with me and I'm letting it steal my life from me. Our foundational thought for this morning is that mature believers are constantly assessing areas of life where forgiveness is an issue. In other words, we are constantly asking ourselves, have I forgiven? Are there still people who I need to forgive? Are there still people from whom I need to seek forgiveness? Adam Hamilton says this: when we become Christ's followers, we are to move away from the path on which we do things that hurt ourselves and others and separate us from God. But instead, we're to begin to follow Jesus on a path marked by grace and mercy and forgiveness. So at the most frightening, the most devastating, the most painful moment of his life, Jesus' first thought is to look at the crowds of people around him, some of whom are actively participating in his crucifixion, others, as we'll see today, who are passive participants, and his main concern is that God forgive them. And so he requests, Father, forgive them. The question we're going to be talking about today is, how do I forgive people who have hurt me when it hurts so badly? When the pain is still fresh, when the pain does not go away, when the wrong that that person has done to me hasn't been undone. I still carry the consequences with me. We're going to see in the story from Luke's account this morning that there are three different types of people in the crowd for whom Jesus asks forgiveness, and they are three different types of people who also hurt us and to whom we are expected to extend forgiveness as well. We're going to see that these people are the overwhelmed, the devastated, and the deceived. And so our one sentence sermon this morning is that Christ's example calls us to first walk in the shoes of those who have offended us. We begin with the overwhelmed. We're told that as they are on the road to Golgotha, they have beaten Jesus within an inch of his life. They have put a crown of thorns on his head. They've hoisted this heavy cross upon his shoulders. And as he's walking this road, he becomes weak and he stumbles and he falls. And so the soldiers look around and they pick out of the crowd an innocent man who's just watching what's going on. And his name is Simon of Cyrene. And we're told that the soldiers seized Simon, they put the cross on him, and they made him carry it behind Jesus. In other words, Jesus has every right to be angry at Simon of Cyrene because he's now actively participating in Jesus' pain and destruction. Back in the mid-90s, a 27-year-old college graduate by the name of Elizabeth Wurtzel rocketed to fame and notoriety when she published what became a best-selling memoir based on her struggles with depression in her college years. It was entitled Prozac Nation, Young and Depressed in America, and Wurtzel became an in-demand speaker. She became very, very well recognized in the United States, and you would think that having that kind of success so early in life would have made her happy, would have helped alleviate the depression that she wrote so vividly about in Prozac Nation. But actually the opposite happened. She continued to struggle with depression, and so in an attempt to help with those symptoms, doctors prescribed her some Ritalin to try to help her get some energy to move past these feelings of lethargy and hopelessness and helplessness. And it did. It cured the depression, or it alleviated the symptoms. The problem was she got really fond of the Ritalin. She began to crush it up and to snort it, and eventually she began to shoot it into her veins, and she became addicted to Ritalin and then to cocaine and later to heroin, and her life began to spiral into this chaotic mess of addiction. And so the follow-up book to Prozac Nation that came out 5 or 6 years later was based on those experiences, and it was called More Now Again, a memoir of addiction. And she spoke about the struggles and the insights that she gained there. Listen to what she says about addiction. I hate to think that the drugs all come down to loneliness, but that would seem to be the case. They, the drugs, are reliable company. I don't need, much less want, people around when I'm using. No one around me seems to be able to touch my loneliness. They can take away my drugs, but I cannot imagine that they will ever be able to take away my loneliness. Wurtzel creates a very vivid picture of someone who was seized, who was caught in the grasp of an addiction, and it came to define her life. Mental illness and addiction, back and forth throughout the rest of her life. And despite the fact that she was a brilliant person, she died at the age of 52 late last year from health problems created by her addiction. She was a very sad and depressed person for most of her life. Okay. There we go. So we are told that that Simon of Cyrene was seized by the Roman soldiers. The word here in the Greek is a very vivid one. It's epilambano. And it's a picture of somebody being overpowered. It's a picture of somebody being laid hold of or brought under the possession of a larger, stronger, more influential party. What this tells us is that Simon didn't want to go out. He didn't want to take part in Jesus' torture and crucifixion, but he had no choice. It's the same picture, it's the same idea that's associated with someone who's caught in the throes of addiction. And many of the people you will find as you begin to analyze it are people who didn't intentionally mean to hurt you. Maybe they didn't even want to hurt you, but there were other factors in their life that overtook them, that caused them to do those hurtful, those careless, those thoughtless things that made your life more difficult. We get a better sense of the meaning of this word in Acts 21 when Paul is preaching in the streets and the Jews become so angry that they start a riot and they begin to accuse him of being a heretic. And we're told here in Acts 21 that the whole city was rocked by these accusations and a great riot followed. And look what happens. Paul is epilambano. He is seized, he is grabbed, and he is dragged out of the temple. The picture is of somebody who is involuntarily being carried along by somebody or something else. And so our first insight today is that the people around you hurt one another sometimes because they're powerless in the grasp of other sources of pain. We're going to look at some specific ones here in just a second. They wound, in other words, primarily because they are wounded themselves. You can see some examples here of overwhelmed people, people who were seized by factors that caused them to hurt us. Obviously, people with addiction, people who have anger problems, many times have allowed that to spiral out of control and they feel helpless in its grasp. Mental illnesses of all kinds, people who have experienced trauma, many times people who are experiencing financial worries, their sense of the world and how it works and what they're capable of or are not capable of doing is changed. And then finally, health problems. So stop and take just a moment and ask yourself, who are the people that I'm angry at, that I'm carrying bitterness against, who were possibly seized, overwhelmed by things beyond their control that caused them to hurt me? Our first key point is that forgiveness begins with remembering that no matter whether they meant to do it or not, other people do not have the final say. Our hope must always be in Christ alone. Paul exhorts us in Ephesians chapter 2 to remember that you also were once separate from Christ. You also were once foreigners to the covenants of the promise. You had no hope, you had no God in the world. And so the first fix for this as we ask ourselves, how do I forgive this overwhelmed person who has hurt me, is simple, but yet is deceptively difficult. And that is to reorient your hope. Ask yourself, am I basing all my hopes on the fact that this person is going to see the light and realize they hurt me and come and apologize, fix it, make it okay? Or is my hope in Jesus alone? Andy Stanley puts it this way: in the shadow of my hurt, forgiveness feels like a decision to reward my enemy. But in the shadow of the cross, forgiveness is merely a gift from one undeserving soul to another. None of us deserves forgiveness, but all of us are caused to give it. The second type of people is the devastated. So Jesus is being dragged down the road. Simon of Cyrene is carrying the cross, and Luke looks around and he observes that there's another large crowd trailing behind, and these include many grief-stricken women. These are women who had financially supported Jesus' ministry. If you read the Gospels closely, you see that much of the financial, much of the practical support comes from people who the rest of society really didn't care about. Among those were the outcasts and the women. And so again, Jesus has every right to be upset. There's this crowd of women, and instead of doing something, instead of saying, this is wrong, stop, they simply follow along crying and wailing, helpless in the face of Jesus' devastation. In 1960, C.S. Lewis wrote a book called A Grief Observed, and it was about a very profound event that happened in his life. If you know much about Lewis, who wrote The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and was a very well-known, prolific Christian writer, he was single until his mid-50s. He and his brother Warren lived together, and they were confirmed bachelors, but around the age of 54, 55, Lewis struck up a correspondence with an author in the United States by the name of Joy Davidman. Joy Davidman was a brilliant author, a brilliant scholar, and he was immediately intrigued by her mind. And so for 2 years, they wrote back and forth, and they became very close, and eventually Davidman, her husband, had left her, and so she came over to Great Britain to meet Lewis and to get to talk with him, and she stayed at he and Warren's estate and spent time with them, and Lewis began to find himself, for the first time in his life, falling in love. And so at the age of 56, Lewis married Davidman, who was about 15 years his junior, and for the first time he had a wife, he was in love, he had children that had come with her, and his life seemed complete. But sadly, just 3 years later, she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and a year after that, she was gone. And so in Grief Observed, Lewis wonders out loud, why would God allow this to happen? To find love for the first time in my life, and now in my early 60s, I'm alone, and I feel even worse than I did before. In describing grief, Lewis observes this: no one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. There's a sort of invisible blanket between the world and me. I find it hard to take in what anyone says, or perhaps hard to want to take it in. It is so uninteresting. You see, when grief gets a hold of us, when that feeling of hopelessness and despair overwhelms us, we are unable in its grasp to care for the pain and the suffering around us, the pain and the suffering we may be causing others. The word here in the Greek for grief-stricken is also a very strong one. Kopto means to be struck or to cut off. It means to cut someone to the heart. We get a better sense of it in Matthew chapter 21 when he describes as Jesus is making the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and the crowds are thronging around him and they're cheering. And it says many of the crowd spread their garments on the road ahead of him, and others cut, or they kopto, branches from the trees, and they spread them on the road. What happens to branches when they're cut, when they're separated from the tree? They begin to die, right? They can't reattach themselves. They can't reanimate themselves. They become a living, dead entity. This is what's being talked about here. This grief had cut them off from themselves, cut them off from their ability to think about or to care about others. They were living, dead entities in the face of this great tragedy. Our second insight is that people hurt one another because sometimes their ability to care about the pain of others is numbed by their own. In other words, they are cut off from their emotions. People like this are ones who are experiencing the death of a loved one. Maybe they're experiencing the loss of a job or a career. They're struggling with chronic health problems. They're going through a divorce, going through a broken relationship with a child, or financial failure. The list could go on and on and on. But as you think back over the list of people in your minds that maybe you need to forgive, I challenge you to ask yourself, how many of these people were devastated by circumstances that were going on in their own lives? I can remember when I was going through my own divorce, and very early on in that, I was so devastated, and the only person in the world I felt like I could talk to was my mother. And so for that first 6 months, I would call her sometimes multiple times a day, and I would cry, and I would rage, and I would complain, and she would be very sympathetic. And then suddenly, at that 6-month mark, my mom stopped answering her phone, and when she would answer it, she would hand it to my dad, and I would be forced to talk to my dad. And I was really hurt by this. I was like, Mom, what are you doing? Where are you? And what I didn't understand until years later was that my mother's own grief, her own devastation over what she saw unfolding and how it was impacting her, brought her to the point where she couldn't take it anymore. She couldn't absorb my grief. She couldn't be a source of hope and help and comfort for me. And so I was able to let go of that anger and that resentment because she was doing the best that she could. And the upside of that was that I spent a lot of time on the phone talking to my dad, and our relationship got much stronger, and I came to love my dad a lot more, and I'm still very grateful for those times when I look in the rearview mirror. Our second key point is that forgiveness is sustained as we force ourselves to remember other people are hurting too. It's not just me, because darkness touches us all. The fix to this is, again, sounds simple, but it's difficult to practice, which is that we need to commit to lead with kindness. Lead with kindness. We take on the attitude that's described in Psalm 103, where God forgives us because He knows how we are formed, and He remembers that we are but dust. We're not perfect. We're not able to solve all the problems of others around us. C.H. Spurgeon puts it this way: to trust God in the light is nothing, but to trust Him in the dark That is faith. When the people closest to us abandon us, when they disappoint us, when they let us down, when darkness closes in, we're called to show courage. We are called to exercise and allow our faith to grow. The last group of people is the deceived. Jesus goes to the cross, and as he looks out over the crowds, his words to God are very profound, ones that we read all the time. He says, "Father, forgive them." Why? Because they don't know what they are doing. This semester I'm teaching child psychology, and one of the things we are talking about, we had this last week, is this transition that children make from infancy to toddlerhood, where they move from just sensing the world around them to perceiving the world around them. In other words, they've got all of this data coming in through their 5 senses, and they begin to take an active role in making meaning out of that. And so that is why I always explain to my students, when you have a toddler and they grab something, where's the first place it goes? In their mouth, right? It's not because it tastes good, it's because they're trying to understand it. They're trying to sense the taste and the texture and the hardness of it. They're trying to make sense out of the world. When we're trying to transition from sensation to perception, from just having data coming in to making meaning out of it, sometimes there's a delay. Sometimes it's difficult. So for instance, you can see the picture up there on the screen. And when we sense it, what we see is a white background with lots of black dots on it. What else do you see there? If you're trying to make a picture out of it, what's in that picture? Okay, could be snow. What if I gave you some cues, if I gave you some help? What if I gave you the word tree? Does anybody see a tree in the picture? Okay, upper left-hand corner, you can see the trunk of a tree, you can see the shadow that is casting, some leaves up above. What if I said the word sidewalk? Begin to see a sidewalk filling it. It's moving from left to right, diagonally up there. What if I said the word dog? Begin to see the dog. If I specify and I say Dalmatian, you see a Dalmatian kind of standing on the sidewalk, sniffing at the ground, right? You are shifting from sensation to perception. And for most of us, we move through situations and we're constantly making this transition. The great Christian poet and philosopher and artist William Blake said it this way: if the doors of perception were cleansed, if in other words this gap between sensation and perception was taken away, everything would appear to man as it is. Jesus is talking about this ability to know. The word here in the Greek, eido, means to perceive. It means to appreciate. It means for that click to take place where, oh, now I see the full picture. It's to grasp truth without a doubt. Jesus talks about this when he's criticizing the Pharisees, and he says, guys, grow up. Move from sensation to perception. You fools, you know how to interpret the weather signs, the earth and the sky, but you don't know how to interpret the present times. Life is happening around you. The kingdom of God is at hand. I am doing great work, and all you see is black dots on a white page. People have been asking me about the infamous basketball game that took place in Newton earlier this week. It was all in the news. Everybody saw it. People were asking, were you there? Did you see what happened? And sadly, I was there. And I certainly was not at the extreme of parents running on the court and yelling at referees in their face, but I was up in the stands and I was not being very nice, to be really, really blunt with you. When 7 technical fouls are called on my son's team and they are shooting 5 free throws to 30 for the other team, I'm getting a little bit hot. And I was up there, and certain people from this church who were also there, I'm sure saw me. And I was standing up from time to time, and my face got about the color of my tie. And I was having dizzy spells because I was yelling so loud, and I was having to sit down. And I felt like I was justifiably angry. I was enraged. And my dad, who's usually very calm and cool and collected, was similarly outraged, and he was yelling about as much as I was. And if you can picture my mother, she was yelling as well, and so as was everybody around me. It was really loud in there. So after the game, I'm driving home and my hands are shaking. I'm just furious. You know, the season's over and this was so unjust and I can't go to sleep. And I'm laying there, and this is usually when God talks to me in these moments, and he says, well, are you proud of yourself? You made a real idiot of yourself tonight. And I was like, no, God, you don't get it. This was terrible. This was unjust. The referees were horrible. And he says, well, it may be, but you acted like an idiot. you got way out of control. And the picture of myself began to flood back over me, and I started to realize how I must have appeared to other people. I reached that point of I perceived, and I wasn't very happy with what I perceived, and so I had to repent. And I can tell you, I'm not proud of this, but when I was leaving the high school, if one of the referee's dogs would have walked by, I would have kicked it. And if I would have had something to throw, I would have thrown it. By the time I reached this point, by the time I woke up the next morning and I calmed down, I realized, if I see some of these people, I need to apologize. I need to ask their forgiveness. So we hurt other people because we are deceived. In the circumstances, we see things one way, reality is the other way, and we have to make those two line up. People who are deceived and who've hurt you in your life may continue to be experiencing strong emotions. It may be they're reacting to fear or to doubt. Rapid change, when change is happening in society and in the world and in our culture, tends to bring people to a place where they act out in anger. Disappointment, and then strangely, both success and failure can cause us to be deceived, to see ourselves differently than we really are, and to act in ways that are not appropriate. Last key point is that forgiveness brings healing as we bear in mind that we will never, on this side of eternity, see the full picture. We will always see it imperfectly. We will always see it based on our own biases, our own opinions, and we will make mistakes. We will do stupid stuff. We can only share our truth and receive the same from others, which is why Paul cautions us in Ephesians 4, speak the truth, speak what you see in love. Don't be angry, don't be full of rage, don't be nasty, don't be belittling or condescending, but speak your truth in love, and then receive the other person's truth so that you can find reality somewhere in between. Speak the truth in love, and as we do so, we grow in every way more and more like Christ, who is the head of his body, the church. As Soren Kierkegaard says very profoundly, there are two ways to be fooled. One is to believe what isn't true. The other is to refuse to accept what is true. So the fix for learning to forgive the deceived in our lives is very simply to give it some time. As we calm down, as we begin to understand things that we didn't see before, the picture comes into focus and we are able to forgive. 3 questions to ask yourself this week as you process some of this information. Question number 1, is my hope wrongfully placed in what others say and what others do? Is that where my hope for my life really truly is? Number 2, is my first impulse to punish others for letting me down? I'll raise my hand on that one right there. That is always my first impulse, and I have to rein that in. I have to ask forgiveness for that. And I have to continue to strive to make kindness my default instead. Lastly, am I usually in a rush to assign blame? When something goes wrong, do I immediately look around and go, it's your fault, it's not my fault, you guys are responsible for this, you fix it, or I'm going to be mad at you. And instead, what would it look like to slow down? What would it look like to allow that perception process to take place?